Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to our live stream. We are here today to talk about some mental health issues because as we know, May is Mental Health Month, Mental Health Awareness Month. So I am here, I'm Dr. Chrystal Evans. I'm a clinical psychologist and I am here to work with my colleagues here, Aseanté Renee, and I'm going to allow her to introduce herself and then I'll do some more talking in a minute.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, everyone. As Dr. Evans said, my name is Aseanté Renee. I'm a licensed medical social worker, which means I'm a therapist and a social justice strategist with almost 2 decades of experience in social cause marketing, facilitation, and culturally inclusive community engagement work across the nation. Much of my work lives at the intersection of social justice, healing, wellness, therapy, and entrepreneurship. I previously served as the director of communications for a nonprofit that focuses on alternative responses to incarceration. And prior to that, I was a policy advisor with a project of the Department of Justice where I led the reconciliation work between communities of color and local law enforcement in 6 different pilot cities. Some of my other work includes director and producer of a digital series, Ever After, Stories of Accountability, Violence and Healing. And this is where we actually talk to crime survivors and ask them what type of criminal justice system would they create for themselves if it was in fact centered around them. Currently, I am a therapist with Renewed Focus Psychology Services and the owner and principal consultant at the Aseanté Group, a social innovation firm focused on equity and accountability. Thank you all again for having me here.
And we also have with us today, Jarrett Harper, and I will allow him to introduce himself as well.
Good afternoon, good morning. It's kind of backwards, but I did that on purpose. It's part of the tools that I use going into Mental Health Awareness Month. I'm Jarrett Harper. I'm an advocate and an ambassador for Represent Justice. I'm also the founder of Better Days. We're working to end the foster care to prison pipeline. I'm an officer at Human Rights Watch in the children's division. And today I'm really excited to be here to really share with you all some of the issues that system impacted folks face and some of the challenges that we actually go through, but also the tools that a lot of us use, and some tools that the ones that are not really able to use them at this time, we're really going to talk about that today, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Jarrett. As I said, I'm a clinical psychologist, as mentioned before, and my primary job is to work with individuals to help them identify areas of their life that just isn't working. We've all seen images on TV of what that looks like, and that's sort of what I do. You know, I sit across from people and we do something called talk therapy. And talk therapy works for many people, but there are so many other forms of help that we can get to assist us in moving through daily crisis, daily issues that come up as we're, juggling life. So it's really important to know that there's not just one way to address challenges. And in light of the things that have been going on in the world today, we thought it would be really great to have this particular group of people get together because there's so much going on in terms of our mental healthiness, between the George Floyd death and murder that we saw, that the world witnessed, between the social isolation we've had with COVID, all things that seem to be happening at the same time. And it's brought about so many changes immediately. And another change that we don't talk a whole lot about is how the entire world shifted to virtual. A number of huge companies were doing a little bit of virtual interaction, scheduling meetings and things virtually. But for the most part, everybody pivoted to an entire different way of communicating. And it also created a different level of isolation for us because we're kind of working in silos now. But it did also let us know that we can be resilient and refocus and find ways of managing. So with that said, as a clinical psychologist, I do that talk therapy as I talked about, but I also manage mental health programs. I've worked in a number of community agencies that are based in our communities, and I primarily serve our Black and Brown people. But I've been trained across the board to work with everyone. I don't discriminate. um, I feel it's important to help the communities that have been underserved and who have not been afforded the resources that other people that have been more privileged have had. So I've dedicated my life to giving back to my community. Um, I've worked in federal prison. I've worked in a sexual assault clinic. I have also worked in a medical setting where I did psychological testing and evaluation for people who were experiencing sometimes car accidents, sometimes workers' comp issues, where they had an injury on the job. And I've also done assessments for people that are seeking asylum. They're refugees from a number of different countries, and they needed to have a court-ordered psychological evaluation. So I would meet with them and talk with them about the trauma they experienced. And that brings me kind of full circle to what we're going to talk a lot about today, and that's the trauma, the impact of trauma on our lives and how we move through that. The reality is there are a number of people who suffer from traumatic injury and don't even know it. We walk around daily. And because the scale is so large, you know, trauma can affect people in so many different ways. What is traumatic for one person isn't necessarily traumatic for another. So a lot of the work that I do, I work at the Department of Mental Health on a regular basis as well. And I work in specialized foster care, which actually works with children and their families and how the impact is affecting not only them, but those around them as well. And we ensure that all children who are coming through the system and young adults are afforded therapy, and that includes sometimes medical services in terms of the psychiatrist. If there's some substance abuse issues that are happening, they are enrolled in therapy with a clinician, either who is trained or skilled in that area, or with a substance abuse specialist. There are also medical caseworkers who assist them to get services in the community that they might need, housing resources, parenting classes for parents, and a number of other programs that they would not otherwise know of or have access to. So we like to ensure that we kind of give them the entire gamut of what they need. My role with Represent Justice is working with a number of ambassadors to train them on trauma and on anxiety, depression, and things of that sort, and to act as a consultant as well. Wanted to give you an overview of what that looks like or what my job looks like, because a lot of people don't know. The interesting thing is I laugh because I sometimes can clear a room when I tell people at a party or something that I'm a psychologist, because everybody assumes that I'm analyzing them. And I joke about it, but I say, unless you're paying me, I'm not going to be working overtime. You know, if I was an accountant, you're not just going to clear the room, and you wouldn't just assume that I'm going to give you free advice without paying me. So that I joke about that, but the reality is I'm not constantly evaluating people. I'm actually probably not that judgmental. I like to look at people in the context of who they are and what their narrative is, and I like them to define that for me. So I think that that's some of the work that we do. And I think Aseanté could kind of weigh in on that as well in terms of how she initially interacts with people.
Sure, in terms of if I'm in a room and we're making sure I'm not necessarily therapizing people. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, it only happens when we're invited, right? The therapizing only happens when there is an invitation first. Most times we're just observing and interacting with folks as is. And there are times, just because we are a bit more attuned, we are aware when trauma might be showing up when we're interacting with people. And so I think on some level it kind of helps us to have a little bit more empathy, because we realize in certain situations, like, that's not about me. That response and that reaction, that's probably not about me. Maybe 10% of the time it's about me, but the rest of the time probably not about me. So
Mhm.
I definitely agree with you. I'm gonna have to use that phrase. It's like, if I'm not getting paid for it, I am not on the clock. I'm just showing up. So
Yeah. Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about, um, just so we have some context. Anxiety and depression are probably what we see a majority of, because the anxiety is how we act out the feelings and the thoughts that we have. A lot of what we do is kind of that intersection of working with our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And our thoughts and our feelings kind of dictate what our behaviors are going to look like. Our reactions are the things that we can really control. And we like to focus on those because we can make changes that we need to make as a result of realizing that this isn't working for me so much anymore. Um, we have seen since COVID and since the social unrest that we've seen in the communities for the past year and a half now, we've seen a rise. I think it's probably at about 12 or 13% in my area of work, but it might even be significantly higher in a lot of other community agencies. Because a lot of times we're feeling this isolation, and that's kind of one of the areas of anxiety that is probably mostly affected. When we don't feel like we have a sense of control over something, we feel like there's some kind of doom and we don't know what that means, and the unknown is very scary for us. So we see different types of anxiety popping up with people who ordinarily are able to manage their day-to-day lives. And because this is happening, as I said, with the COVID is happening at the same time, it's kind of this whole um, different way of looking at things, because on the one hand we're isolated because of COVID. On the other hand, we realize that we have this need to be in the community and connect with our community on things related to the social unrest. Wouldn't you say so, Aseanté and Jarrett?
Yeah,
Jared,
absolutely. I mean, really going into what took place with George Floyd, um, as an advocate, as an ambassador, as someone who was recently released from prison a little under 2 years ago. You know, when I first watched what took place, I instantly had anxiety run through my body. I instantly was traumatized, specifically because I had a horrific encounter with a police officer when I was a foster kid at 8 years old. Still to this day, I I still have a knot on the back of my head after running away. You know, he hit me in the back of my head and shoved me in the back of the car. And for over 30 years, I accepted that it was my fault that happened, because I didn't want to listen, or I was squirming, I was trying to get away. So when I saw that happen to George Floyd, it made me question my logic in supplying that officer with a just reason to harm me. But when I saw what took place with George Floyd, I couldn't help but realize that it wasn't just. It was actually wrong. And really just processing what took place, it I was re-traumatized all over again, to really be honest with you. And it was a lot. I knew that I had to work towards some type of resolution for myself first and foremost, but I also could see that our larger community was also traumatized. And it's not always easy to find those resources when it comes to healing and restorative justice, when everything on the inside is seems to be, there's like this huge imbalance. But then when we look outside of ourselves and we look out into the community, the same things are happening. So it was real tough for me to actually find peace and logic and forgiveness and actually look towards a brighter day, looking at what just took place and also connecting it to what I actually experienced. So when I think about the anxiety and I think about, this month and what this month actually means, it's just really encouraging to really share space and really talk about solutions to mental health issues. I was looking at the paper yesterday, and alarming statistics: 47 million Americans suffer from some form of mental health issue, right? And that's all across the board, right? From anxiety to trauma to abuse, right? There's a gambit. So actually discussing this topic with you guys today and really trying to share some of the solutions that we all use, I just really think that it's important, and I think it's needed, specifically at this time. There's so much unrest going on and anxiety being so high.
As we talk about the restorative justice issue, I think it's really important to look at how there are so many people suffering from generational trauma.
Right.
Generational trauma where we kind of inherit what our parents, what our grandparents experienced, because we still haven't come to a place of resolution, because the resolution, it's held outside of us. So we haven't even had the opportunity to really manage all those symptoms that we're experiencing. So when we're experiencing this type of anxiety that we're talking about, and it comes up in different ways, there are different types of anxiety. There's generalized anxiety, there's social phobia, there's, specific phobias, there are things that even come up like agoraphobia that ordinarily you wouldn't think of being related to it. But if I'm afraid of certain things, or if I'm afraid of going outside, or if I'm afraid of engaging with people on a larger scale, it's sometimes a reflection of what I have been traumatized by.
Mm-hmm. And many of us have been forced to normalize our trauma, right? And so we don't even actually realize that it's trauma. Jarrett, you just spoke to that. You just figured that's how life is. This is just the way things go. And so I do believe part of this pandemic and this reckoning and the uprising that happened last year forced everyone to stop. And you couldn't distract yourself with the things we typically do, particularly here in America, to not deal with our trauma, to not go deeper, to not engage those things and ask ourselves, why am I like this? Why do I respond like this? Why does this trigger me, right? And so we have used something that has been a coping mechanism for so long to normalize our trauma that kind of got ripped away. But that's the thing about growth. The thing that once protected you becomes the thing you ultimately have to break away from, which is the irony of it, right? This was my protection, and now this is the thing that I have to break that was once my protection. And so I think there has been an opportunity for a lot of that now, but with that, realizing that you have been traumatized and it's not normal brings about a whole nother level of things you now need to process to start the healing journey. And healing isn't easy. That's why a lot of people don't do it. It is messy, it's hard, it's not linear, it's scary, it's painful, it's beautiful on the other side, but the mess to get to that is the work, right? And I do believe we are in an interesting point of reckoning in our country that is requiring us to focus on that, deal with that, not run away from that in a way that we could before.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's so interesting. Jarrett, you spoke a moment ago about forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And I think that given your story, given your narrative, given your experience and your move towards resolving your issues of trauma, can you speak a little bit about how you can even put forgiveness into your narrative?
Yeah, great question. Great question, Dr. Evans. One of the hardest journeys has been to forgive. it's a daily practice. It's not something that just happened because I wanted it, because everybody said that this is what you should do. It's something that I had to want for myself. And it really started while I was in prison. That's where I developed an understanding, first of forgiveness, before I could even make it an action in my life. Once I actually understood it on a level to where I actually could embody forgiveness in the sense of receiving it and giving it. That's when I really began to really value myself enough to say, you know, something, not only am I worthy of forgiveness, but other folks are worthy of forgiveness. And that's one of the catalysts that propels me into a mindset that forgiveness has to come up at some point in time if I want to be well, right? If I want to do better, if I want to be happy, right? If I don't want to hold on to issues that plague me, if I don't want to constantly be re-traumatized because I'm so upset, I'm so hurt because I haven't started that journey towards healing. So forgiveness for me has been everything. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's not. It's my world, right? It's what gives me enough fuel to move past not only the trauma that took place in my life, but the trauma that took place in my mother's life. It goes all the way back to the transgenerational trauma. So forgiveness, again, when I think about mental health, when I think about wellness, I think about forgiveness because it provides me with so much purpose and energy to be kind, not just to other folks, but to myself, right? And that's really how I've lived within my forgiveness.
Thank you for that. Aseanté, how do you see the issues of trauma and of forgiveness and working through coming up in your work?
With most trauma work, kind of before I said like we often normalize it, it really does start with forgiving yourself. Most of the time when trauma is connected to an individual, it is something that's been put upon them, and trying to make sense of what has happened and why the trauma happened. We go through the what could I have done differently? How could I have responded differently? What should, all the woulda, shoulda, couldas around the situation or around the experience. And it's first starting with forgiving yourself. It's like you did nothing wrong, nothing that you did deserve the way that the trauma, was put upon you or showed up in your life. Like you didn't initiate it, you didn't contribute to it, like you didn't deserve that type of trauma to happen to you. And so it really does first start with having people forgive themselves around what's going on and just giving themselves grace. Like this is a process, it takes time. And so helping them to understand the grace that they need to give themselves as they work through the different parts of the trauma, taking time, being honest with themselves with how much they have capacity for to engage around that trauma to begin with, and where they need to like hold a boundary. And only after that work has really been done, do we really get into so who should you forgive around this? Because sometimes forgiveness for other people isn't something that people can give at that moment. And sometimes I don't necessarily believe forgiveness is a requisite for justice. If someone like has harmed you from a justice place, you don't necessarily have to forgive them in order for justice to be connected to it. But that's the part I think comes after the comma, right? After you've done the work with the individual and they are more healed and more whole in themselves and are forgiving themselves more. Can we speak to, so now who external, like outside of you, do we need to discuss and talk about forgiving?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I got into a conversation recently about forgiveness and moving on. And I somehow started talking about that 40 acres and a mule that, I still haven't seen. And the reality is, I don't want the 40 acres. I don't need the 40 acres. And I certainly don't want a mule right now. So what helps me is to look at the bigger picture. We didn't ask to be here, but we're here. And I could either choose to go back and continue this cycle of generational trauma and like embrace that to its fullest, or I can go back and say, you know what, enough is enough, and now it's time for me to heal from that, and I've got to figure out what that means, you know, because it's different for different people. Healing comes in different forms, as we've talked about. The trauma, the experience of the trauma itself comes in different forms. But we need to figure out individually what happened to me that caused me to be this person today. And then I can choose, and that's where the power is. I can choose to heal from that and take the steps I need to take. And what does that look like? How, you know, do I enroll in therapy with someone like you or someone like me? Or do I go on this journey on my own? I think for the most part, Jarrett, you did a lot of self-reflection and a lot of work on your own, correct? I mean, you had some stints here and there. What has your mental health journey look like from a mental health interaction?
Yeah, I mean, being placed in prison as a child, our society made me do the work by myself. And I don't say that with this pride that other folks should be made. I think that folks need to be able to go to folks and get help. That's what I should have been able to do. I shouldn't have had to do it alone, but I did do it alone for a very long time. But also there was a community right inside of prison, right? There was a community of men who had a range of sentences of life without the possibility of parole, 50 years to life, 70 years to life, 2 years, 6 months. This community provided me with what I needed to start that journey that Aseanté talked about, right? That journey towards forgiving. But before I could get there, I really just had to sit within myself. That's one of the things that I noticed coming home. I noticed that everything is moving so fast out here. Everybody has somewhere to go. Bills don't stop. Money needs to be made. The children need to be fed, right? There's societal issues. There's so many things going on. And I realized that there's not enough time to sit with yourself if you don't make the time. I was forced because I was placed in a cell to where I used that time to really sit within myself and really search, right? To become the introspective person that I wanted to be, right? So sitting with yourself, not isolating yourself, but sitting with yourself and actually getting to know oneself has been one of the most rewarding things when it comes to my journey towards healing, when it comes to my journey towards forgiving, first off, myself. I think the best lesson that I took coming home after forgiving myself was the understanding that for me to really forgive myself personally, I had to give up hope for a better past. I had to stop going backwards and saying, I wish that this had happened. I wish that had happened, because I realized that I was re-traumatizing myself. In comparison to that happened, there is a lesson somewhere in there. It's hard to figure it out, but there is an answer. And my job, as long as I have breath in me, is to learn, is to grow. And it's what provides me with the healing that I actually need, because when I actually put positive things in myself, it somehow, some way pushes those ugly things kind of out the door to where they're kind of in the past, right? It's part of me letting go, right? A lot of folks, use different terms for forgiving, and that's one of the terms that I've had to use, and that's let go of that past and look forward to the future, but still honoring what took place in the sense of the lesson that I learned. So again, that's a lot on how I actually came to grips and how I now move forward as an ambassador and as an advocate and as a Black man in America that demands justice, right? And part of me demanding justice is first being just to myself, and forgiving myself and doing the work on self first. So again, so that I am whole and complete and well.
Absolutely. You mentioned loss, and I think that's been a really, really significant word that we have experienced. We lost a lot I mean, we had been losing it all along, right? We as a community, but I think we lost a lot when COVID hit and we were just shut down. We didn't talk about the loss so much there. We talked about the loss of George Floyd's life. We talked about the loss of, I can't go outside anymore, but we lost a lot. And with loss, what do we need to do? We need to mourn it. And that means not shoving it under the couch, not shoving it into a closet. It means really bringing it out. Just like if we lost, when we talk about mourning and when we talk about loss, we talk about death. We're usually talking, I lost my father and I had to deal with what that meant. But we can lose an experience. We can lose something that was really significant to our lives that's not necessarily tangible. And I think losing doesn't always have to be something good. It also doesn't have to be something bad. And as we talk about this transition into like a new state of being, it's really important to talk about like the loss, because pre-George Floyd, we just knew a bunch of people were dying, but there was really no direction in how do we manage this? And we felt a sense of loss every time another Black or brown person died on the streets, but nobody was really hearing us. What was so beautiful about that loss, and I might get some slack for hearing it, but George Floyd served as so much more for us than just a dead body on the street. It allowed us to really look at what this loss meant, the loss of him, and it propelled us to a higher state. And what was beautiful, it wasn't just Black and brown people that felt that loss. At that point, we saw so much more. We saw people of different cultures, people of different ethnicities marching with us all around the world. That's when it hit me like, oh, people are finally getting it. People are embracing this loss. And now as we pivot to another place on this journey, we can really say that we can hold hands with our brothers and our sisters and really allow them to experience this loss with us. So this mourning looks a little bit different for us.
Yeah.
It's interesting that I appreciate that you brought in the conversation around mourning and what that's looked like, because part of what we lost is the traditions that we have to mourn. And so mourning, and if we're taking it purely from like when we've lost loved ones and we've lost certain people because we were restricted and unable to do the thing where we celebrate people's lives. For a while, like you couldn't do the funeral, you couldn't do the rituals that people tend to do to help move them through the healing process. And so that in a way got suspended. And so on some level, people didn't actually get to express their loss in a way that they have done in the past. And so some of that may still be in limbo. So as we're opening up, I'm curious what it looks like to, yes, it might be a year or sometime later, but how do we honor that thing that we couldn't do then and honor that loss now to kind of help with the next stage of closure and healing? The other piece of that is there's a very interesting point of privilege when it comes to grief, right? There are many people that do not have the privilege of grief. And when I say privilege, I mean being able to just stop and grieve and do what you need to do. There are so many essential workers who have not had the privilege of grief. There are so many people who work on the front lines that have not had the privilege of grief. There are so many people and many of those people on the front lines are Black and brown people, who kept the US, kept the world going, and serving, people in the service industry did not have the privilege of grief. And so how that looks, and of course now like the thing comes across really loud, so I'll pause for a second. Okay, no helicopters, so just now. But and I'm curious about how that looks like with people who have privilege. Like if you have any type of privilege, how are you leveraging your privilege to make space for grief for other people who may not have had it in other instances? So if you are a manager and a boss, like how are you making space for folks to have their grief, to sit with those moments, to not have to come into work, to call in Black, to call in brown, to have those spaces to just be and not have to choose between grief and productivity or grief and paying a bill, because those are false choices. And so that's an interesting thing that I believe is going to come up more in this time as folks are starting to come back into work and we're starting to move back into what you said, this new state of normal. Not even new state of normal, just this new state of being, because none of this has ever been normal. But this new state of being, how are people who have the privilege of grief using their privilege to make space for those who have not been able to grieve, based on whatever the different intersecting reasons may be?
I really, really, really like that, mainly because we know that resources are needed and in the professional space, as well as for folks that are like me, that are system impacted, that are coming home, right? There's so many stigmas on mental health issues, on grief, right? Folks are not they're not in a place, or they're not being encouraged to actually speak up and ask for the type of help that we actually need, right? Because we don't have the time, right? We don't have the resource, or we don't have the privilege to take that break. But just because we don't have it doesn't mean it's not needed. One of the needs that's actually imperative is that we as citizens, we as human beings acknowledge that more resources are needed. We can look at the homeless population, right? We all see it every single day. We know that mentally healthy folks are not going to walk out in the street. Mentally healthy folks are not, mentally healthy folks are not going to be on the streets talking to themselves. We know that there's health issues, mental health issues taking place. So resources are something that's vital, it's needed. And if we don't supply folks who are going through these traumatic experiences with resources, we don't just do them a disservice, but we do ourselves and our children and the future a disservice if we don't begin to heal, right? Because the trauma, the pain, it doesn't go away just because it looks ugly, just because it's an eyesore, right? It only gets better when you tend to it. And part of tending to it is supplying resources, right? Supplying time, right? Investing energy, bringing your expertise to the table and using innovation in a way that is 21st century, in comparison to thinking that mental health it's just their problem. It's just a Black problem. It's just a brown problem. And in reality, it's all of our problems, because we all deal with some type of mental health issue at some point in time in our life. Right? 47 million people deal with mental health issues today. Mm-hmm. It's a high probability that everyone in America will fall into that 47 million at some point in time. Right. So if we know that, I just think that it's best that we start applying those resources today compared to waiting for it to be us. Right. We don't want to be on a back end of trauma and depression. I know what it looks like. It doesn't feel good, and it's not productive when it comes to advancement. All right. So yeah, I just thought that was really powerful, Aseanté.
I want to talk about some resources. Oh, Aseanté, go on.
I was just going to say really quick, I love that you brought that into the conversation, because it's about being equitable with our empathy and making sure when those mental health things come up, we aren't criminalizing Black and brown people for the same things that we would, rally around and support, white people for. And so when we're talking about like the mental health components, like how are we being equitable in our empathy around this? You don't see this person who's talking to themselves on the street and be like, oh gosh, what did they do? It's, oh, what happened to them? It's turning to curiosity and turning to wonder. So even in our own bias and our own implicit bias and how that's showing up, where are we shifting and becoming more equitable with our with our empathy around those things when we see that, because that just shows the humanity of people and speaks to that in a way that I think we've lost at times.
And I think that's an interesting topic because traditionally Black and Brown people have not sought out professional help for mental illness or what they perceive to be mental illness. Traditionally, we've seen our white counterparts going into therapy and boasting about it, like it's a badge of honor to be in therapy. You know, my therapist says this, or my therapist told me to do that. Whereas as Black people, we typically go to church. Our mamas tell us don't talk about this stuff outside our family. You know, it's just not been acceptable. So I know that in my community work, it's been really a struggle breaking through that barrier. You know, typically we want to, as mental health professionals, the first thing you do once you walk in the door is you try to develop empathy. You try to develop a sense of rapport. You try to develop a connection. And what I find when I'm working with African American and Latino people, I have to really break through the barrier of, okay, this is a safe space and it's okay to be here. And it doesn't mean you're crazy, whatever crazy means. It does not mean that. The reality is, in my private practice, most people that walk through the door have typical everyday issues. How do I pay the bills? How do I make my marriage work? And how do I parent without beating my child because they've done something egregious? So these are things we all deal with every day.
Right.
And yet nobody's getting help for it, right?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. So that part around, well, just go pray, go talk to your pastor, go, and when that comes up, I tend to say, okay, well, I get that. There is also a scripture that speaks to, God made some to be prophets, to be, to use their voice for speaking, to use their gifts for all these different things, right? To be healers, to be nurturers, to be caregivers, to be caretakers. Well, God also made some people to be therapists and psychologists. So we weren't given these gifts to not use them in a way to help you. So if that is how you understand it and that's how it makes sense to you, consider this a spiritual gift that people are using and you're still getting the services that you need.
Mm-hmm. And the beauty is we get it. We're still human too. It's not, when I'm working with clients, I'm not above them. I don't know anything more. Most times I am walking away learning something
every
from
time.
Everybody I've worked with.
Every time. Like you tell your clients, like, you are the expert on you. Exactly. I am just here to help connect some dots and be an objective eye, but there's like breaking down that power dynamics, like, oh, I'm the therapist. No, I'm a human that's coming in who has an objective view because I'm not in the muck right now. But you are the expert on you, which means you already have everything you need in you to heal. And empowering people to do that is more of a like teaching people how to fish, because to be completely honest, they see us once, twice a week. They live in the world their whole lives. And so to your point, like being able to say like, this is your work. I'm here cheerleading and helping, but you're doing the heavy lifting, is a beautiful way to shift that. And we always come away learning, like, now I've learned more about me.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah, I was sharing that I see myself as a tour guide, a tour guide of your life. You as my client, I'm going to help you to see how things in your life haven't added up, or how you've been reactive to something and that hasn't been helpful for you. But I'm really just pinpointing and showing you those things, because sometimes we just need to look in the mirror and we don't. And when I say we, I mean we, everybody. We collectively have to do this work. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about some of I'd like each of us to just go around and just talk about what we do for self-care, because self-care is so much a big part of this. What do you do? What do you two do for self-care when you do just one thing?
One of the things that I do, I actually wake up with intention. One of the first things that I do when I get up, I pray, right? And then I meditate on what I just prayed about, right? And I'm sending up as much positivity as I can. I'm as honest as I possibly can be. And I start my I start my beginning being honest with myself first and with my spiritual advisor, right? And that actually sets my day on a positive course in comparison to waiting for something good to happen and then saying like, oh, something good happened today. Nope. When I woke up and I prayed and I meditated and I sent up what I sent up, that's when my day started off right.
Mm,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
love that.
Absolutely.
Uh, I say no. That's one of my self-care things. Like I say no now as a, recovering people pleaser. I say no. When someone brings something to me or when there's something that's I feel like I need to do or I feel obligated to do for whatever the myriad of reasons may be, I check in with myself and I ask myself, do I really want to do this? Do I really need to do this? What do I actually need right now? And then I choose me.
There you go.
And whatever that ends up looking like, sometimes it's different world reruns on Netflix and sometimes it's showing up right for people. But it's saying no and holding boundaries because I deserve them.
Mhm. Absolutely. Um, One of the things that I think is so important and that I try to do, and I don't do it on a larger scale, but breathe.
Mm,
I think it's so important to breathe. We often forget to breathe unless you're a yogi, and my thing is more Pilates than yoga, but both of them stress breathing. And it's amazing how the analogy, like you can breathe yourself into a bigger stretch. If
mhm.
you can't do the splits, if you breathe right, you can do a little bit more split than you thought you could do. But you have to learn how to breathe. And I often tell the people that I work with, breathe through it, no matter what the stress is. If you stop and regulate your body, you can actually manage your emotions better. So when we talk about meditation, and
Mhm.
when we talk about a lot of anxiety disorders being really responsive to meditation and imagery, you're breathing through that and you're getting in touch with your system physiologically. Our body needs to be regulated. There's something called the fight or flight. When we feel a sense of fear or something we're in danger or something happens to us that makes us, kind of scared about what is going to happen next, our body immediately either shuts down or it lashes out. And in order to manage those emotions and that feeling that you're having, that visceral feeling, you need to regulate. And in order to regulate, you do the same thing that we do every day, every second of the day. We breathe. So once we get that kind of on an even keel, we can respond better. And that physiological connection is something that we really have to embrace, and understand that you can do it anywhere, no matter what the stressor is. Whether it's like a fear of some of the things we've been talking about, we're afraid that the police might shoot us. Slow down, stop, breathe through it, because what that allows you to do, it also allows you to check in. What am I doing right now that's putting me in danger? And although I don't have control over what this officer is doing, or I don't have control over what this person is saying to me, this man who's trying to take my parking space in the parking lot, or, you know, my my friend who's saying something that doesn't make any sense. Whatever it is, we have control over our response, and how we can gain that control is by slowing down and taking inventory of what's going on. And once we regulate ourselves, we're better able to respond. And usually, once we do that, we have a calm head and we can really see things for what they are, and make better choices. So I like to say we need to breathe. Um, let's talk a little bit about mental health access and how that can also be justice for ourselves. I mean, the one thing that I see is when I have access to mental health services, I feel like I have control. I can define for myself what I need for myself. And if I have control, then that is justice to me.
Mhm.
How do you two feel about that?
Again, I go back to the resources. right? And privilege, right? Certain folks in our country have had access to the tools that are needed so that they're well. And it's not fair. It's not equal, right? Mental health, it's a health, it's not only a health issue, it's a human issue. It's a humane issue. When I personally look at what took place in my life and what I needed to be well, I needed access to materials. I needed a safe place to be truthful with myself. I needed a space for other folks to come in and share so that I didn't feel isolated. But I also needed an ability to go after those resources, right? I needed to know that they were there, and that's one of the things that folks like myself, folks coming home from prison, that's not always out there for us, right? Or at least it's not easily or accessible for us, right? But when we do put those tools and those things out in front, that's when I believe things are actually fair. That's when it's just, when we actually provide those resources for everybody, right? I look at the recidivism rates in California today, right? It's up at 69%, right? When it comes to African American folks, it's 73%, right? That means a lot of folks are experiencing some type of trauma, because we know that folks don't just wake up and commit crimes. Things happen in our life, right? And if we don't have those resources to cope in a positive way with the issues that we're dealing with, the recidivism rate is going to continue to go up. So I do believe that part of justice is supplying individuals with the resources needed so that we actually lower the recidivism rate and we stop putting folks in prison without looking at what led them to become the kind of people that was capable of committing those crimes in the first place. Right? So again, resources and access, that's justice, right? We have to have it. And when you don't, we have problems in our society that we're constantly trying to repair.
That's beautifully said. I mean, justice by definition is the act of being just and fair. And so if we aren't, I think sometimes mental health access gets overshadowed at times, or moved to the side when we talk about equity and accessibility and those types of things. And to be completely honest, mental health access is a cornerstone of equity. It's a cornerstone of equitable work. We want to talk about making this an equitable and a just and a fair society. Then, to Jarrett's point, we need to have mental health resources accessible, equitable mental health resources, accessible to everyone. And if that's not happening, like, yes, I believe in all the social justice reform work that we are doing. All of it's necessary, because I also think sometimes people try to pit one against the other. This one, they kind of go into the hierarchy of reform needs. And I don't think that's helpful. And I do believe we are not addressing mental health access. That is like a foundational cornerstone point of all this other type of reform work that we are doing. Because if people are not able to access things to be well, to be healthy, to be better, to heal from their trauma, we're just putting harmed people into new systems with old harmed ways of thinking, which means those harmed ways of engagement will still come out, right? And so we're not actually dealing with the root of the problem. And so if we want to be a just society, if we really want to talk about justice and what that means, we do need to be fighting for mental health access and making it more equitable.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'm really happy for is that we do have an administration now that is really focused on funneling money that we need to go to the public mental health systems. So we hope to see increases there. And my hope is that programs will continue to grow and people will focus on education and accessibility. Because the other piece is, just like we talked about before, we want people to understand this is a safe place, and it's okay to go against what your grandmama said. and go get the help you need. And it doesn't always look the same for everybody. It doesn't have to be this talk therapy, or it doesn't have to be traditional forms. I was really happy that my deputy director sent out an email asking about other types of therapy that is in the community. My manager just asked me about that. And I said, wow, that's great. But there's a horse ranch that offers equestrian training. And I remember that I had a client who was fascinated with horses, had never seen one, had never been around one, you know, up close, but that is therapeutic. Therapy looks very different for different people. There's a lot of artists out there who found themselves in that position because they started drawing as a way to kind of escape the noise of, you know, something happening around them that they had no control over. So they started drawing, and that drawing grew into a career, really. And it's really just focusing and centering that artist, but it works. Hey, I'm like, whatever works. And that's something that I wanted to just quickly talk about, some resources that we have right here. Journaling. Journaling is an amazing way that people really get in touch with their feelings. Journaling is not something you need anything special for. You just need a specific piece of paper that you can always go back to. And I mean, you need multiple of them, but you journal anytime something specific happens. You have to journal every day, at least once a day, could be 5 times a day, but it has to be ritual that you go there and you talk about what you feel right now, what the incident is and how you responded to that. And as I said, how you feel about it. And if you continue to do that on a regular basis, you don't even need it to be guided. It can just happen whenever you feel like I'm a little unbalanced. I need to kind of center myself. That's one thing that's really good. I talked about breath work earlier, and that's really important as well. Also, developing a support system. As Jarrett talked about, he talked about his community, and I don't remember the word you used, but I remember you talked about support, and that is so valuable to healing. Knowing that you have that one person, and Aseanté, you also mentioned a non-judgmental, impartial person, someone who you know is there for you, but it's not someone who's like life is dependent on you, because there's something that needs to happen about me, my objectivity, that needs to keep me kind of away. And that's why a therapist, that's why you go to a therapist, because that's an impartial person. It's someone who is not part of that system that's putting you there in the first place. So you want to make sure that you know who to go to. And that person might be someone that you already know. It might be someone at a church. It might be someone that you look up in a directory and figure out that this is a mental health person in my community that I can go to. But make sure you have access to that person. In the 12-step model, it's a sponsor. But find out who that is and what that is for you. Also, there are public mental health agencies that typically there is either low cost or no cost. Navigating through that is a little bit different in different parts of the country. Here, I'm in Los Angeles. I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm going to put this up. I don't know how many listeners we have from Los Angeles, but at least you will have that number. That's 1-800-854-7771. And you can always call in there if you're anywhere in Los Angeles County. And every county should have something set up. Every county in the country, I think, has something set up similar to that. Navigating it might be a little bit different, but hold on to that number if you need to reach out and get some professional help. Any other words of wisdom, Aseanté?
In terms of services, a couple things that people can do if they can't get to a therapist right now or they're in process. Movement. You spoke about the breath work part. That is huge. I'm all for the breath work. I love it. I use it in my practice as well. Movement. Sometimes there's just like a lot of energy, and energy can't be destroyed or created. It just gets moved around. And so movement, like exercising, walking, moving, doing something physical, helps to get some of that restless energy out of you. And if you're sitting here and you're like, I don't want to do any of these things, playlists. Create playlists, create musical playlists, mantra playlists. And it's, it can be songs that you're just like, this makes me feel good. This makes me feel better. And no judgment of the song, right? It could be something from Kirk Franklin to Pearl Jam. Like it doesn't matter what it is. If it makes you feel better, if it gives you some type of joy, or if it's lyrics to a song that speak to who you are, because sometimes music gives us words that we don't have for ourselves. Like, create playlists. And if you start to feel low or start to feel a way about a thing or starting to get anxious, maybe put the playlist on and let the music kind of help with that. And take it back old school, coloring books. Get a coloring book, $2.99 coloring book and some colors, and just, because it helps to just kind of slow things down for a bit. So those would be my recommendations as well.
Absolutely. Love those suggestions. Love them. Okay, Jarrett, do you have anything in parting that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I would encourage folks to be kind to yourself, be gentle to yourself, and know that you're valuable, and know that what's taking place today, it's like you have to have time to allow things to change. Specifically for me, I came home a little. I always go back to exactly how much time. A little under 2 years ago, I was released from the California State Prison. And with time came the release of parole just 3 days ago. When I first came home and they told me I was going to be on parole for the rest of my life, I was like, oh my God, I just finished serving life without the possibility of parole. That's going to be too much. But with time, things changed. With time, I'm now going to be a father, right? I thought at one point in time in my life that I would never, ever have a family. I'm now going to be a father, right? I really utilize time, right? That's one of the things that I want to encourage folks to do. Know that time is your friend, right? It's one of the saving graces that we all have. And I think we should start looking at time as something positive in comparison to there's not enough. There's more than enough. We just have to use it for ourselves in a way that actually builds us and leads us into healing.
I love that, Jarrett. And with that, I want to look at that reframe, because that is so powerful. Typically, when we think about someone who's been incarcerated, we think about doing time. And you beautifully have reframed that to work for you, to say that this is my power. This is the essence of what I do have and what I do have control over. And that puts me in a very safe, healthy, mentally healthy space. And I appreciate that reframe. And I think that that's so much of what we have to do, is positively reframe things that seem so negative, but step back, do some work, and figure out what positive can come out of this situation. And we find ourselves in a healthier space. So with that, we are going to sign off today. I appreciate all the work that is happening on our mental health in our communities. And I hope we continue this work. It ain't over yet.
It ain't over yet.
Not over. It's the marathon.
Have a good day, everyone.
Be
Bye,
kind to yourself.
Be kind.
Bye, everybody.
Be kind. Be kind.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. I think it's still recording.
Yeah, it's recording. It's not live though. I'll stop.
Oh, okay.
Okay, cool.